10 and welcome to another video. So today we are doing something a little bit different to what we've done recently, and we're actually going to do a comparison. So a comparison between the culture of Weimar Germany and the culture of Nazi Germany. And we're going to do that by looking at two interpretations. So I'm going to start off simply by reading those two interpretations. First of all, can I just say I'm really sorry for sending out a document with two typing errors in it. So where it says concern houses, it means concert houses. Okay, so that should hopefully make more sense to you guys. So interpretation A, from Germany by John Nicol and Robert Gibson, written by a German poet who lived in Berlin in the 1920s. So already looking at the provenance of interpretation A, we get that they're a poet, so somebody in the arts, in the creative industry, and somebody who lived through the experience of 1920s and therefore Weimar culture. And this is what it says: theatres, operas and concert houses were filled to capacity. European artists from Paris, London and Rome who came to Berlin were excited by it and didn't want to leave. The atmosphere was electric. So, an overwhelmingly positive... Sorry about that, that was some loud bang outside my house. So, interpretation A is overwhelmingly positive about the culture of Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Moving on to interpretation B then. So, this was adapted from a letter written by Professor Mallard of the Berlin School of Art to the Nazi Minister of Science and Art in 1933. So, from reading the provenance of the source, 1933, kind of light bulb moment should be going off in your mind. 1933 is the year that the Nazis came to power, and this is somebody who is a professor, so somebody who's kind of in the sort of academic world who is writing to the Nazis. So, kind of makes you wonder, well, why would they be writing to the Nazis in the first year of the Nazis coming to power? And when you read what they've got to say, it becomes evident why they're writing to the Nazis. So it says, in recent years, developments in art have led to chaos. The experimental ideas that have been foisted on German art must be taken care of. Everything that encourages subversion must be thrown out, just as the new government has already done in political and economic life. Okay, and then underneath I've just put subversion is the undermining of authority or power. So this is very different to interpretation A. It is basically saying that the Weimar government allowed chaos to ensure around the culture and the arts of Germany during the 1920s. And this guy, he's basically writing a letter to the Nazis to say, look, I'm on your side here. Please don't fire me, because the Nazis fired a lot of professors and a lot of learned people. He was basically saying, I'm on your side. I support what you're going to do with arts and culture. Okay, in other words, they're going to get rid of what the Weimar have done. They're going to get rid of that freedom of expression from Weimar times and introduce a new culture. So this is the moment where I want you to look at the knowledge organisers that I have made for you. One on the Weimar art and culture and one on the Nazi art and culture. And think about, well, what evidence can we draw from these knowledge organisers to support what the authors of the two interpretations are saying? So to begin with, interpretation A, this idea that the atmosphere of Berlin during the 1920s was electric. Well, you can draw upon a range of evidence to support this. Okay, so for example, things to do with the cinema and nightlife. You can talk about the Threepenny Opera, which became very popular in theatres across Germany, especially in the cities. You can talk about Metropolis, which was like one of the most technically advanced films of its time, and it was given hugely positive reviews. Think about like when Avatar came out, for example. Hugely technical film at the time. It was the first one to go into cinema as a 3D experience. Well, you look at Metropolis, and that was the sort of the equivalent back in the 1920s. It was incredibly technical for its time. I know now we can probably look at it and think, really, it's not, it's, clearly no CGI, etc. But, this is the very early parts of cinema, and Metropolis is a really good example of how, Germany was leading the way for kind of cinematic experience. So that's an example you can use for Weimar culture. You could also talk about literature. The anti-war novel All Quiet on the Western Front is a really good example. Still popular today. It's been translated into different languages. I think that's a good example as well because it's anti-war, which shows you the freedom of expression that happened during the during the Weimar era, and it kind of contrasts to the Kaiser years, because the Kaiser would not have allowed that type of literature to be released. And it certainly contrasts to the Nazi era, because the Nazis would certainly not have allowed any anti-war plays to have been performed in cinema, in theatres. So you can talk about that, and you can talk about how important that was to the development of art and culture. So then you can also begin to look at the other interpretation, this idea that all this freedom of expression, all these new ideas have led to chaos and have led to subversion. In other words, the undermining of authority. And you can look at, well, the way that the German people in the 1920s reacted to Weimar art. So some people embraced it, especially young people living in cities. They enjoyed the nightlife, they enjoyed the music, etc. However, many people, don't forget, lived in rural Germany. They were farmers, and they were looking at what was going on in the cities, and they were just thinking, this is ridiculous, this is not our culture. This is too modern, this is too American for our liking. It's going to result in loose morals, women having babies out of wedlock and that type of thing, and really, a lot of traditional people feared social change. And they were the type of people, of course, that voted for the Nazi Party, because the Nazi Party emphasised traditional lifestyle. And the Nazi Party were very, very critical in the 1920s of Weimar art and culture. So you can talk about how some people saw it as a degenerate culture. In other words, a culture without morals. Okay? And that leads nicely into the second knowledge organiser, which is about the Nazi use of arts and culture. And we can go back to interpretation B here and talk about how those Weimar ideas had to be thrown out, to quote the interpretation. And you can't just throw out a whole load of culture and leave nothing in its place, okay? Because, a country has to have some kind of culture. And Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda, he knew how important culture and art was to society. So the Nazis under Goebbels went about fashioning a new form of art, a new form of culture, so that there wasn't just a void where the Weimar art and culture had been. So, for example, for art and design, you know, I've talked about this person called Hans Schmitz Weidenbruch, who was an artist that painted very traditional oil paintings that showed traditional German scenes, and they were displayed in galleries so that people could see what approved, acceptable art was. There was also concert halls that were playing classical music by famous German composers like Beethoven and Mozart, you know, and these are people you should have heard of, you know, as in these are famous composers, you know, and the argument that the Nazis had was, why are we going and watching a three-penny opera, which is subversive and degenerate, or, you know, what we should be doing is sitting in a concert hall listening to our brilliant composers, our musicians that have produced amazing pieces of orchestra, you know, and for that reason jazz music was banned, because it was seen as American and especially Black American culture, you know, and they really put this emphasis on traditional German music. In the same way, they introduced new films. So they saw the films as being a propaganda opportunity. You know, you go and you watch a film, so therefore the, you know, German race had to be seen as the hero. There was a kind of prejudice against the Jews shown in many films. So the villain was often either a Jew or a communist, or sometimes even both, you know, and that was kind of reinforcing that stereotype that the Nazi Party wanted to instill upon the German people. So in that way, they threw out all the Weimar culture, which resulted in freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and they replaced it with what is effectively propaganda alongside traditional music that predated World War One. So that's kind of your knowledge that you can use to analyse the two interpretations. So when you come to answer your questions on these interpretations, you need to have that knowledge in the back of your mind. The first question, 4-mark question, how do the authors have a different interpretation about the popularity of Weimar art? So with that one, you just need to identify the difference between A and B. A, saying it's popular. B, saying it needs to be thrown out, it is not popular, or maybe it's popular for the wrong reasons with certain groups of people, and the majority of German people want traditional art and culture instead. Simple, okay? You use mini quotes or paraphrasing the interpretation. You remember it's only 4 marks, and therefore you do not go into depth. Okay, 1 paragraph will suffice. Question 2, why do the authors have a different interpretation? Well, this goes back to the provenance, and this is the only time really when it comes to interpretations that you need to look at the provenance. So A is a little bit complicated because it's written in 1985, but it is taking into account something that was said in the 1920s. So it's kind of taken sources from different places, put them together into a book, and this is somebody, you know, a poet from the 1920s. So this is somebody who would have lived through that experience of the Weimar culture, and especially him living in Berlin, the capital. Okay, so he would have experienced firsthand that cultural experience. It'd be like nowadays living in somewhere like Hong Kong, which is one of the most modern cities in the world, you know, and seeing technology and culture and art and everything on your doorstep every day, you know. That's somebody who's going to probably support it, otherwise he wouldn't choose to live in Berlin. If you weren't a supporter of all of that art and culture, you wouldn't live there in the city centre. You wouldn't be a poet as well as a chosen career. Interpretation B is a professor who's looking to keep his job because professors are being accused left, right and centre in 1933 of being political opponents to the Nazi party. You know, he wants to keep his position within a university, and he's doing that by basically, you know, tearing into Weimar culture and saying it shouldn't have existed and trying to get the Nazis on board with his ideas and saying, you know, I will support what you do with culture and art. So he's got an agenda, he's got, you know, his own career to think about. You could even go a little bit further and say, well, you know, many poets and professors and lecturers were sent to Dachau concentration camp in 1933 for being, you know, political opponents, either socialist or communist. So, you know, this person had a reason, his own personal reasons, to be against Weimar art. So again, with that second question, it's only 4 marks. I've probably said too much there. I've probably included too much detail. You don't need to go into a huge amount of detail as to why these 2 authors would have different opinions. Then you've got your 8-mark question, which, don't forget, requires you to draw upon your own knowledge. Which do you find most convincing about the popularity of Weimar art? So you're going to trust the poet from the 1920s who is praising the art and the culture of the time, or are you going to trust the professor who is saying that this needs to be thrown out? Now, a more nuanced approach, in other words, a more grey, not so black and white, this guy's wrong, this guy's right approach would be to say that actually interpretation A does show the views of many people living in Berlin, you know, artists, poets, you know, and certainly middle class and young people who were enjoying the culture of Berlin. You know, that reflects that side of things. Interpretation B could reflect the views of conservative members of society, people in rural Germany who maybe didn't have as much first-hand experience of what was going on in Berlin and certainly preferred a more traditional culture that kind of predated World War One. And you can talk about Mozart and Bach with that, these famous composers that, you know, were a part of German culture or traditional German culture. So you can talk about that. You can talk about how different people had different opinions, and the popularity of art isn't clear cut. It's like, you know, if I was to take, you know, anyone to an art gallery, say we go to National Gallery in London, you know, there's so many different styles of art. You know, I love 17th century art. It's amazing for me personally. You might prefer something else, you know, and so what's popular with one group of people, not so popular with others. And there's different reasons for that. So that would make a good answer to question 3. Okay, so have a go at those questions. I want to see as many of you doing this developmental task as possible, because I'm not going to lie, not many of you have been submitting them to Teams recently, and I really would like to see a few more people doing that. Okay, post on the chat if you've got any questions. Thank you.